Well, since U.S. President Donald Trump raised the aluminum tariffs to 50% in June, Canada has been shifting its aluminum exports to other parts of the world. My next guest says this high-level tariff on aluminum is simply not sustainable.
It is one of the most widely used metals on Earth.
Global demand for this resource, which is significant today and going to be much more significant in the months and years ahead. And to have a third of the relative to the global reserves, to have a third of that resource present right here in Saskatchewan, that's a significant discussion.
A 25% increase. We're going to bring it from 25% to 50%, the tariffs on steel into the United States of America.
A sudden rule change in the US shook the aluminum world, but it turned into a big win for Canada. As US buyers faced higher costs and shortages, Canadian aluminum became more valuable and in demand. While Canada's industry gained strength and new opportunities, American businesses were left struggling with rising prices, tight supply, and growing pressure across key industries. The most consequential disruption to the North American aluminum supply chain in decades did not begin with a Canadian policy announcement or a government export restriction. It began in Washington. President of the United States, Donald Trump, signed a proclamation doubling Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum imports from 25% to 50% under the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. The rate applied to imports from nearly every trading partner on Earth. For Canada, the single largest supplier of aluminum to the United States, the doubling created an immediate and measurable supply shock, whose consequences are now flowing through construction, automotive, aerospace, and packaging industries across the American economy. The tariffs went into effect within hours of the announcement. The disruption followed within weeks. The U.S. aluminum tariffs on Canadian imports followed a steep upward trajectory throughout 2025. Initially set at 25% in March, the tariffs underwent a dramatic increase to 50% in June, effectively doubling the rate within just 3 months. This rapid escalation created an environment of exceptional volatility for mining companies and metal traders alike. The tariffs were implemented under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, which allows the U.S. government to impose duties on imports deemed to threaten national security. The strategic dependency that makes this escalation so consequential for American manufacturers is not marginal. Canada supplies approximately 56% of all aluminum imported into the United States. It is not one of several suppliers competing for American market share. It is by significant margin the dominant external source of a material embedded in virtually every major manufacturing sector in the country. When tariffs at 50% hit the primary supplier of more than half of America's aluminum imports, the supply chain does not simply absorb the cost increase and continue operating. It restructures, and not in ways that benefit American consumers or manufacturers. Canadian aluminum smelters sharply reduced primary metal exports to the U.S. following the escalation in tariffs. Beginning in March 2025, the U.S. reinstated a 25% tariff on Canadian aluminum, which was then unexpectedly doubled to 50% in June, causing significant disruption to established trade flows and leaving Canadian exporters little time to adjust. Major producers such as Alcoa Corp led this shift by diverting more than 100,000 metric tons of Canadian aluminum away from U.S. buyers to alternative global markets, mainly in Europe. This pivot was facilitated by the fact that approximately 30% of Alcoa's Canadian production is not bound by annual contracts, allowing flexible redirection to more favorable markets. This is the supply shock in its most direct form. Canadian producers faced with 50% tariffs on US-bound shipments did not absorb the cost and continue selling into America at reduced margins. They redirected volume to European buyers where tariffs did not apply. More than 100,000 metric tons of Canadian aluminum that would previously have entered American manufacturing supply chains instead moved to overseas buyers. The aluminum did not disappear from global markets. It became unavailable to American manufacturers without paying the full 50% tariff premium. Combined steel and aluminum exports from Canada in 2025 declined at a faster rate than the comparable period in 2018 when the US previously imposed Section 232 tariffs at lower rates. The US targeted these industrial metals at lower rates during the 2018 tariff episode, 25% on steel and 10% on aluminum. Relative to the month tariffs became effective, the 2025 decline in Canadian exports has been steeper. The comparison matters because it establishes that the 50% rate in 2025 produced a more severe trade disruption than the 25% rate in 2018. Higher rates produce larger export declines, and larger export declines produce larger supply gaps on the American side of the border. The industries absorbing those supply gaps do not have quick alternatives. The United States does not produce sufficient primary aluminum to meet domestic demand. American smelting capacity has been declining for decades, constrained by high energy costs relative to Canadian hydroelectric-powered aluminum production in Quebec and British Columbia. The tariffs were framed as protection for domestic aluminum industry. The U.S. imports roughly 1/3 of the lumber it consumes because America does not produce enough softwood lumber to meet domestic demand. And the same structural logic applies to aluminum, where Canada accounts for nearly 85% of all U.S. lumber imports in wood products, while in aluminum, Canada's share of U.S. imports exceeds 56%. The National Association of Home Builders estimated that Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum could add $1,500 to the cost of a U.S. manufactured car. Aluminum is embedded in automotive body panels, engine components, wheels, and structural elements. A 50% tariff on the material that supplies more than half of American aluminum imports translates into cost increases across every vehicle assembled in the United States that contains Canadian source metal, which is most of them. Canada's response to the tariff escalation maintained counter tariffs specifically on steel, aluminum, and automobiles, even after removing retaliatory measures on most other U.S. imports effective September 1, 2025. Canada's counter tariffs on steel, aluminum, and automobiles remain in effect as negotiations with the U.S. continue in recognition that the U.S. maintains tariffs on these sectors without providing an exemption for CUSMA-compliant goods. As of September 2025, Canada is imposing 25% tariffs on $15.6 billion worth of U.S. steel and aluminum imports. Canada withdrew its broader retaliatory tariffs from most U.S. goods, but held the line specifically on metals and automotive, the precise sectors where American tariffs remained in place and where Canadian industrial exposure was most concentrated. That targeting is deliberate. Retaining counter tariffs on steel and aluminum while removing them elsewhere signals that Canada regards metals tariffs as a distinct and unresolved issue requiring a specific resolution, not a general CUSMA negotiating concession. Aluminum and related products account for 23% of all U.S. duties collected on Canadian imports in 2025, behind only automotive products at 29%, with iron and steel at 21%. This has created a fragmented Canadian economy, where a subset of sectors faces a significant trade shock, while most other exports continue to enter the U.S. duty-free. The CUSMA review deadline of July 1, 2026 approaches, with the metals dispute unresolved on both sides. Canadian officials have cautioned that a 100% U.S. tariff would have severe and immediate consequences for both economies. Steel and aluminum tariffs could add $1,500 to the cost of a U.S. manufactured car. Canada remains structurally exposed, with approximately 20% of its GDP reliant on exports to the United States. And economists estimate that the 2025-2026 tariff cycle has already reduced Canadian GDP by 1.5 to 2%. The supply shock running through the American aluminum market is the consequence of a tariff structure applied against the dominant external supplier of a critical industrial material without an equivalent domestic production base ready to absorb the volume those tariffs displaced. Canadian producers redirected exports to Europe. American manufacturers paid more or found less. The 50% rate remains in force as both governments approach the most consequential trade negotiation deadline in a generation.